Yay. And it doesn't look like there are any frames dropping. That's awesome. I may have fixed that. Cool. Awesome. What's going on, everybody? It's Andrew here for Bowery Mick History. Um, Thought I was going to do this show yesterday. Ended up doing it today. Probably will be doing it Thursdays now for the time being. Until the schedule changes again. Probably. It will. It always does. But anyway, um, so had a couple things planned for this morning's stream. Um, then something happened and I changed that plan only slightly. Um, so the plan just got bigger. Um, so yeah, let's get into it. I have a couple things I wanted to talk about this morning. The first thing is going to be very nerdy, but anyone who's followed Bowery Mick history for a while now knows that I'm a massive nerd, especially when it comes to things like Star Wars. In fact, I did a whole stream months ago, I almost said years ago, but it's only been months, about the historical influences found in the Star Wars franchise. And anyone who's a big Star Wars fan undoubtedly is aware of the recent Star Wars series on Disney Plus, Andor. And so I'm going to be talking about some of the historical influences in the third episode of Andor. So if you haven't seen it, be aware that I am going to be spoiling the fuck out of it. That being said, though, let's get into that. So yeah. So bit of a quick summary of the episode. It's the third episode. The main character, Cassian Andor, played by Diego Luna, is essentially wanted for murder, and is trying to flee from the law. Essentially, the law is a sort of militarized private corporation, police force of sorts, and they're going to the planet where Andor is living, go and arrest him because one of his friends got jealous and ratted him out. Whole big drama there. But what was interesting is in the episode, we see this police force. They're called the corporate police or something like that. I forget what they were called exactly. But they are portrayed in a sort of... There were some very interesting details in how they operated and how the local populace reacted to them that made me think of, well, one of the pictures that you see right there. And there were some other things that I found really interesting. Most notably, when the police escalate the situation, you see all the residents of this city that they're searching for Andor in, start banging on, everything, sort of raising the alarm. And I guess not a lot of people noticed that, or noticed that that was may have been a slight historical reference, because it kind of was. For those who are not super up to date on the history of Ireland, particularly the history of the Troubles in Ireland on the later half of the 20th century, it was a fairly common occurrence when the Royal Irish Constabulary or Royal Ulster Constabulary or the British Army or both would go into a neighborhood, predominantly Catholic neighborhood. A lot of the people living in that neighborhood would start banging on pots, pans, trash can lids, anything to make a lot of noise, as a sort of warning that, hey, the army's here. And so that's, I would argue that I would probably wager that probably inspired that particular scene in the Andor episode. And then you also have, this sort of weird standoff between the, militarized police, and Andor, and I think the character's name was Luthen or something like that. Um, that ends in a literal fucking car bomb. So there were some, at least I saw, and I think a few other people may have pointed it out on Twitter. There were a couple sort of details that were sort of inspired by the Troubles. Um, and I think that was really interesting. I think, the series is sort of about this, the origins, or roughly the origins of the character that was first introduced in Rogue One, but also the early days of this rebellion, and this, insurrection against the Empire. So it kind of makes sense that they're drawing from other famous rebellions, other famous rebel organizations and practices in their depiction of this fictional rebellion. Um, and I actually had a little thing I'm going to drop in the chat for y'all. Hopefully it works. Yes. Yeah, so that link to a song about, from the Troubles period, about banging on a trash can to let everyone know the army's coming. It's a great song. You should listen to it. Not right now. After the stream. But yeah, yet another piece of historical influence found in Star Wars, which I'm always fond of. I'm always it's good to see that some of those traditions in Star Wars in particular are still going strong. All right, now moving on to the next thing. So some people may know this, some people that may not. Um, Bowery Mick History began as a blog where I wrote about history things. It was more or less a place for me to write about the things that I either was not allowed to or just couldn't write about in college. I started it when I was still in college, actually. Um, and, the blog is kind of quieted down in recent years, ever since I started doing, live streams and podcasts and all these other things. It is somewhat difficult to maintain multiple platforms all by yourself. But at the same time, um, it does, not being expected to put out a blog every single fucking week does allow me to put a bit more time and work and research into blog posts, making them better. And so I've started working on another blog post that will hopefully be out maybe a month or two. We'll see. About James Connolly and the socialist movement in the United States around the turn of the 20th century, pre-World War I, essentially. Particularly looking at it and its relationship with race and ethnicity. Because not a lot of people know this, or maybe some people know this, the early socialist movement, especially in the United States, had a big problem with diversity. And that's actually a part of that actually contributed to a feud between Conley and several other American socialist leaders during Conley's brief residence here in the United States. So kind of the goal of the blog was to sort of explore Conley's relationship with race and ethnicity in his work as a labor activist and socialist leader. So digging into that, a lot of interesting stuff. Found a whole article about Conley's relationship with the Jewish community of Dublin in the early 20th century, which is really interesting. And one of the interesting little factoids I found in that article was apparently Arthur Griffith, who is the founder of the Sinn Féin political party, which is still in existence today. It's it's the most nationalist political party in Northern Ireland. So nationalist, in fact, that its elected members still don't take their seats in the British Parliament in London. But yeah, apparently Arthur Griffith was a raging anti-Semite. Who knew? Well, I guess he did, and I guess everyone else at that period did. But yeah, that's not something that comes up a lot because Arthur Griffith goes on, becomes this like, one of the big voices for Irish independence and an Irish republic, and then a big supporter of the Irish Free State in the 1920s. So that kind of everyone focuses on that. No one really focuses on the fact the guy was a raging anti-Semite. But oh well. But yeah, the goal of the blog post is to just kind of like figure out where Conley stood and fell within this very diverse field of views during that period, which is I'm really excited about because I like writing about James Connolly and I like reading stuff about James Connolly. James Connolly is awesome. Um, or maybe he's not. We'll find out. But yeah, moving on. The big thing that I really want to talk about today, so like the big point of this episode, Ulysses S. Grant. I've been doing a little bit of reading into Grant lately, just in my free time, but not Grant the general, like a lot of people want to, read about and talk about and whatnot. I've been looking more into the Grant presidency, which is one of my favorite presidencies to actually study, mainly because of just how it falls in American memory. A lot of people often think of the Grant presidency as this disastrous presidential administration, rife with scandal. And to be fair, there was a fuckload of scandals. That was unfortunate for Grant. That being said, though, it does tend to overshadow a lot of the good that Grant did as president. And, to put this into context, Grant takes office 1860. I think he's sworn in 1869. He is following Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson makes a fucking disaster of his own goddamn administration after the death of Abraham Lincoln. Johnson gets impeached, basically shows his true colors as being more or less a Democrat who just didn't like secession. Um, all those things really just tried to kneecap Reconstruction in the wake of the Civil War, and just makes an enemy of the entire Republican Party of that era. And so much so that they impeach him. I think he's the first first president to get impeached in the history of the United States. And Grant comes in. He is this big hero. He won the Civil War. Everyone loves him. He's unconditional surrender Grant. He is nominated. He wins pretty easily. And he goes to work essentially trying to fix a lot of the issues that Johnson created or Johnson just let go unaddressed. And it's under Grant that we get what many call radical Reconstruction, where it's very, very, or some people would say it was extremes, making the South really pay for secession and for the Civil War. And it was very unpopular amongst many Southern whites and many white Democrats. But it also saw the enfranchisement of Black Americans. It saw attempts, at least in the short term, to bring civil rights and equal rights and treat Black people who up until that point had been enslaved, to treat these people as people. And that is a big part of Grant's presidency. He was a big supporter of the 15th Amendment, which extended voting, or was supposed to extend voting rights. He was also a big proponent of executive action against organizations like the Klan. He was a big supporter of the Ku Klux Klan Act, which allowed the federal government to use military force to fight the Ku Klux Klan, and treat it as the terrorist organization that it was and is. Um, anyway, um, and that often gets overlooked by all of the scandals that lead to a very transitional cabinet. I don't think transitional is probably not the best word for that, but some of his cabinet posts were like a goddamn revolving door over the course of his 8 years as president. And there are other things you can criticize Grant for. His policy regarding indigenous peoples was awful, just like every other president before and pretty much most of the presidents after. Um, and I mean, he one of the big issues that kind of plagues him throughout much of his life is he assumed rather that um, the people that he hired to work for that he would choose to work with, they had the best of intentions in mind for the greater good. And he does this even after his presidency, and in actuality, that leads to him trusting a lot of people who are very self-interested, have no real care for what happens to everyone else, just want to make themselves either more rich or more powerful or both. Um, and so that does lead to a lot of issues during his presidency and after. And he does actively try to fight the corruption that he accidentally lets happen, but it does do a lasting bit of damage on him, even during his presidency and well after. I mean, to this day, he is. A lot of people still think of his presidency as one of the worst in the country's history, when in actuality, he did more for civil rights than any president before him, and most of the presidents after him. And that's really something you got to take into account when we decide, was he a good president? Uh, he did some good. He did some pretty good things. He did some pretty good things. It's not his fault that the what was it, Cleveland? Hold on. Who was president after Grant? Was it Hayes?
No, the end of Reconstruction, so it would have been, yeah, it would have been Hayes, right?
It was
It was the
Hayes.
end of Reconstruction.
Yes, thank you. Not Cleveland. It was Hayes. Hayes and everyone after him just kind of say Reconstruction's over and just let the South or white Southerners essentially undo everything that was done. Um, so that's not his fault, though. That's not Grant's fault. Just Hayes, that fucker. And a system of white supremacy that was ingrained into the American culture. Anyway, so yeah, so as much as I am not a huge fan of Ron Chernow, because I do think his writing style does make you kind of um, just fall in love with the subject, even if there are some very obvious flaws. This is most evident in Chernow's Hamilton biography. That being said, Chernow's Grant biography I actually thought was really good, and it does delve a lot into the Grant presidency, the good and the bad. And Cherno does make a very convincing case for, reevaluating President Grant, as well as reevaluating General Grant. Um, and so if you're looking for a good recent book, I actually do recommend Chernow's Grant biography. It's a couple years old, and it's long as fuck. I listened to the audiobook because I didn't have time to read that shit physically. But it actually is a very good book, and I do recommend it to anyone looking for a good Grant book now. Also, you can never go wrong with Grant's memoirs. Anyway, so um, that was the big chunk of the episode. The next thing is our interesting historical thing of the week. Um, I was digging through some of my files on my computer, cleaning shit out and whatnot, to hopefully make this stream work better. And it seems to have actually worked because I only dropped 149 frames this episode, which is awesome. And I just stumbled upon this. I don't know when I downloaded this. I don't know where I downloaded it from. All I know is that it at some point ended up on my computer, and I tried finding it again. I scoured the internet for like a good like day and a half trying to find where this damn thing came from. No idea. So, for those who might be wondering, this is a photo of two French officers during World War One. As you can see, the guy in the back is having a little fun at the expense of his comrade, who's just in front of him. Um, and I thought it was an interesting photo because it's judging by a lot of the things that we see in it. We can kind of place it around 1915, 1916. You can see they're wearing Adrian helmets, which were introduced in late 1915. And they also seem to have some kind of covers on those helmets, which were also introduced around the same time and were eventually phased out by the end of 1916. So that puts it somewhere within late 1915, early 1916. The uniforms are in kind of like a transitional state. It looks like the puttees, leg wraps, are a bit darker than the rest of the uniform. So it does seem like kind of a transition period, which the French Army's uniform was constantly going through transitions, but possibly the most notable transitions happened 14 into 15 and then 15 into 16. So, and if I were to guess, I would say this was probably taken somewhere in the vicinity of Verdun. Now that is just that's a lot of guesswork. I have again no idea where these guys are actually stationed, but I did like this photo because it showcases an interesting juxtaposition. You know, you have these two guys, you know, having a laugh, you know, joking around, showing like a still relatively healthy sense of humor in the midst of the horrors of the Western Front of World War One. So it is, you know, it is this interesting juxtaposition. You see lots of photos like these all the time throughout the war, but a lot of them in the first half of the war, usually, when everything is still relatively new and no one really knows just how bad this thing is gonna get. But yeah, that was. If anyone actually knows anything else about this particular photo, if they've been able to identify the unit or the place or both or anything else, please do me a favor because I would love to know. Send an email to barrymickhistory@gmail.com. And if you have a photo or some other kind of artifacts or something that you think would be cool for this section of the show, send me an email to that same email address, barrymickhistory@gmail.com. I would love to show it off. I can't find. Eventually, I will find. I will run out of things in my own personal. I don't want to say collection because I don't own most of these things. These are mostly shit that I find in the public domain, mostly. Um, but please, I'm always interested to hear from the audience and to work with the audience, and all credit will be given where credit is due. So that's all I had for this week's episode. Hopefully, providing nothing else changes, we'll be back next week, Thursday, at 11 ish, maybe. And yeah, that's all I got. Anyway, here's sausage Poilus. Have a good day, folks.